this is a wild claim. I want to show you some of these video clips, but this is actually, this is Zippy Hot-Tabali. She's the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. Now, we're all aware that Hamas has an extensive underground tunnel network in Gaza. That's been known. That's not debated. That's not disputed. Well, what has been known is that it's about 300 kilometers of tunnels all around. And what we've been watching over these last few weeks is Israel say, oh, there's these tunnels under these hospitals, so that's why we have to. Well, first they were saying that they were Hamas headquarters, that they were Hamas command centers. And so that is why they were striking these hospitals and why they were striking Christian churches and why they were striking schools, is because they were all Hamas command centers. And when it came to the hospital, there was obviously a lot more scrutiny. What they showed us underneath that hospital as evidence were just tunnels. And what we also know is that Israel built tunnels themselves underneath those hospitals, underneath Al-Shifa Hospital specifically in 1983. But nonetheless, they showed us tunnels. And then the narrative shifted, the goalpost changed, and it became, well, there's a tunnel there, so that's why we bombed this hospital. And many of us were saying, we know there's tunnels there. That hasn't been in dispute. What you're saying is that there was a headquarters there. That is very different than just tunnels. The tunnels are everywhere. I mean, we assume the tunnels are everywhere. 300 kilometers of tunnels, that's a lot of tunnels. So we're assuming the tunnels go all over the place. And you've had hostages that have been released early on. The very first group of hostages, the first few hostages that were released really early on said, yeah, we went through a web of tunnels underneath Gaza. So the tunnels are there. We've known that. But that has not been a reason to bomb everything. I mean, if you're going to say, well, there's a tunnel there, and so that's why so if there's a tunnel, we have the right to bomb, then you're effectively saying we can bomb everywhere. And that's where they move the goalpost. Well, they're moving the goalpost. I would say they're digging into that particular point, and they're basically making the excuse as to why they would need to bomb, get this, every other house in Gaza. Watch this.
I want to tell you something. We thought it was 300 kilometers. As we go deeply into the Gaza Strip, we realize every second house has this entrance to actually to an underground terror city. So they basically turned all the houses in the Gaza Strip to their own facilities. They took over schools, mosques, hospitals, almost everything you can imagine. Think about it as a ghost city that is turning into a terror city because they built this 1,000 kilometers underground city. By the way, it cost $1 billion to do that. So where all this money came from the generous support of the international community, they were thinking they're giving the money to the poor people of Gaza, but eventually it was Hamas stealing this humanitarian aid, giving it to its own military machine, creating this underground terror city. So this whole is horrific as it gets when you think about Hamas abuse of international aid. So you need to make sure Hamas won't exist after the war finishes.
Well, and apparently you're going to need to bomb every other house in order to do that, according to the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, because there's apparently a Hamas opening into the tunnel every other house. And instead of 300 kilometers of tunnels, it's actually 1,000 kilometers of tunnels. There's maybe, so first of all, okay, we know that the tunnels are everywhere. That is how Hamas has had to operate. They're not, the Palestinians are not legally allowed a military. If they were to build bases, if they were to have military command centers that were visible through satellite imagery, they would get blown up. So they, of course, because they're more of a guerrilla warfare force, are embedded within the civilian population because many of them are coming from the civilian population. They're angry people, angry Palestinians who've had everything taken from them, no opportunities. And so they're rising up and they're fighting what they view to be, which is, in my view, an occupation or a very inhumane circumstances for them. But there's another, so rather than making the argument of, well, if there's a tunnel underneath every other house, therefore every other house must be filled with Hamas, there's another possible explanation for that, Zippy, and that might be that perhaps the tunnels have operated as a bomb shelter. There has been a lot of criticism of Hamas. Well, why didn't they build bomb shelters for their people? Israel builds bomb shelters for their people, and look what Hamas does with their money. They just build tunnels for themselves and they don't build bomb shelters for their people. Well, I could theoretically argue that if there is an opening in every other house, then possibly every other house has an ability to get into the tunnel to shelter in the event of a bombing. And that's possibly what those entries are for. It's just a thought. I would guess if the opening is there, people are going to use them, especially if they see that they're about to be bombed. Obviously, that hasn't worked that well because the Israeli military has very sophisticated weapons that they get from the United States. Here's also so now the IDF has said so. There you go. You've got Zippy saying, "Oh, it's every other house." We've got the IDF making claims that they're just targeting tunnels when they were first targeting Hamas command center. So we're seeing this goalpost shift. We're seeing the reasoning as to why they're bombing everything, and it seems to be indiscriminate. No, it's not indiscriminate. They say it's all Hamas. Well, here is Jonathan Conricus. He's talking on CNN about a new report that's come out claiming that 2 out of every 3 people killed are civilians. So 1/3 of all deaths. Right now we've got 16,000 people killed. They're saying 1/3 of them, so at least 5,000, if not more of them, are Hamas. This is directly in contradiction to an earlier report from prior to during the ceasefire that came out, where the IDF admitted that they'd killed about 1,000 to maybe 1,500, which was a lot. The civilian to combatant ratio is very high when you've killed 15,000 people and only 1,000 of them are potentially combatants. They're now saying, oh, no, that's wrong. So that was all pointed out. That was pointed out by numerous outlets, including on this show. And now they're saying, oh, no, that's wrong. It's actually 2 out of every 3 people who are civilians. So 2/3. And by the way, this is a tremendously positive ratio, they say. Watch this.
The horrible tragedy that touches Ibrahim now personally is touching so many. According to the AFP, senior Israeli military officials have said around 2 civilians have been killed for every Hamas fighter that you have successfully killed in the Gaza Strip. So that's 2 civilians for every terrorist. Can you confirm that?
I can confirm the report, and I can say that if that is true, and I think that our numbers will be corroborated, if you compare that ratio to any other conflict in urban terrain between a military and a terrorist organization using civilians as their human shield and embedded in the civilian population, you will find that ratio is tremendously positive and perhaps unique in the world. I understand that there are civilian casualties, and I understand that footage and coverage goes towards emotions and to cover those civilian casualties. But what I want to say is that we will get those figures out, and they will be official and on record by the IDF with the name behind it. And then we will be able to say and to back up afterwards with names and numbers that we are indeed targeting the terrorists. We are not after the civilians, and we're going into great efforts in order to keep it that way.
Yeah, okay. So, tremendously positive, he says, every 2 out of 3. Now, the numbers right now officially are about 15 to 16,000 people have been killed, but there are still 7,000 people missing who are presumed dead. So that number is closer to 20,000 people who've been killed. And the numbers do keep climbing. So the expectation is that it will be, at this point in the conflict, that there's over 20,000 people who've been killed. They're claiming that, so if they are accurate, because there are 7,000 people still missing, if they are accurate and 5,000 now of the people killed have been combatants, which what we've said on this show when we were covering this previously is that, I guess it just depends on how you label a person. And who do you consider a combatant and for what reason? And then you could just really inflate your numbers and you can make yourself feel really good about the fact that you're not killing as many civilians as you probably are actually killing. And that's really what's going on here. But for them to say, well, this is tremendously positive that, when we kill 3 people, only 2 of them are civilians. That wouldn't fly. Imagine the FBI going into a restaurant trying to get the bad guy and they kill 2/3 of the people. There's like a mafia, the mob is sitting there unarmed, really, by the way, because they're going to blow up the place. So it's not like the mob is firing at the FBI and their lives are at risk. They're just they're going to drop they're going to throw a grenade into the place. And 2/3 of the people sitting there are just women, children, civilians. That wouldn't fly in the United States. That wouldn't fly in the world, but for whatever reason, when it comes to war, it seems to be excused and okay. But the reality is those numbers are not accurate. And even Jonathan Conricus, he kind of in the beginning, he was like, well, yeah, I saw that report. And yeah, if that's true, then pretty good job. Good job for us, right? Good job. Pat myself on the back. But the reality is, I think they know that those numbers are not accurate, that there's way more people have been killed, and very few of them have actually been Hamas fighters. And so it's just there they are, patting themselves on the back. Now, one thing that was brought up was Ibrahim Dahman. He is a CNN producer, 36 years old, who has lost 9 members of his family in northern Gaza who were killed when a strike hit his aunt's house. This has hit CNN pretty hard. That is what the anchor was referring to. Here's Jake Tapper. He's also pretty visibly pissed off about this, visibly upset that a member of the CNN's team has had 9 members of their family killed. And you think about this, Justin Amash, a former member of our Congress, had family members killed in Gaza. We've seen reporters from Al Jazeera to all over who are there in Gaza with their family members killed. And now it's hit CNN. And here's Jake Tapper. He really unleashes on Mark Regev, who is a senior advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Watch this.
Seeing that the IDF really has done everything that is humanly possible to try to safeguard innocent civilians.
It's very hard to believe that, especially on a day when one of our producers lost 9 members of his family who are not members of Hamas, not members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, not members of any group, just 9 people just trying to live their lives.
First of all, I extend my sorrow to him and my sympathies. But if I saw your report correctly, and please correct me if I say something wrong, that happened in northern Gaza, in Gaza City, where a month ago we already asked all the civilians to leave. And most of them did. If there was like 1,200,000 people there was only a couple of tens of thousands left. And one has to ask, yes, they had ample opportunity to leave. I don't know what happened. I don't have the specific circumstances. I know there's deadly combat going on now in the north, still between these IDF and Hamas terrorists, yes? And we don't want to see anyone caught up in the crossfire, but why didn't they heed the advice and leave the area?
You can't blame them. There's now
I don't blame them.
But there's fighting in the south now. I've been asking this since October 7th. Where are these people supposed to go?
Into the sea, if you ask Benjamin Netanyahu. That is where they're trying to push them, into Egypt and into the sea. First of all, when he says, well, they weren't supposed to be in the north, we told everybody to leave the north, and most everybody left, and there's only tens of thousands of people left in the north, and they shouldn't have been there. If there's only tens of thousands of people left in the north, wouldn't it be easy to avoid killing them? Or are you just targeting them in order to make an example because you're, once again, really truly trying to shove everybody south to clear the north so that you can take it? That is really the end game there. You're not going to let anybody back into the north. And now that the fighting has moved to the south, you'd think that they'd say, okay, come back north. We cleared the north. You can come back north. We're going to go hit up the south now. But no, they're not doing that. They're shooting at people who try to go back north. And they're killing people who are in the north. And they're saying, well, it's too dangerous for you. Because why exactly, when there's only tens of thousands of people left out of millions? It's not densely populated anymore. So what is your excuse? It's not like, well, people are there. We're trying our best. Sometimes, it's so densely populated. We're killing people. No, not when there's tens of thousands of people left. That excuse falls on deaf ears. I want to show you this poll. 61% of voters now support the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire. 49% of them being Republicans. So half of Republicans want to see a ceasefire. The majority of Democrats want to see a ceasefire as well. About 76% want to see a permanent ceasefire. So Americans are not in line with Congress. The Biden administration seems to be, the Biden administration seems to kind of say things like, in indicating, and Blinken kind of indicates like, well, we're telling them to cool it a bit. We're trying to talk some sense into them. But at the end of the day, they're not actually telling them to stop, and they can. Who's really in charge here? Because I think what we're seeing is, as much as people believed that, well, the U.S. is really in charge and It's because we give Israel money. And so really, if this is the United States' fault, that doesn't seem really very believable anymore. It seems like the U.S. maybe has their hands tied and that Israel's actually the ones in charge. And probably because they have a lot of allies who are spending a lot of money, who have bought off a lot of American politicians. Because the American people want to see a ceasefire. And we're under the impression that it just takes the administration demanding it from Israel and cutting Israel off financially to not allow them to continue on with their genocide. We are not going to go down well in the history books on this one. Wrapping up on Israel before we move on to other things here. The U.S. is going to actually start sanctioning certain members of Israel, some Israelis, basically the settlers who are going around creating a lot of violence in the West Bank. Secretary of State Antony Blinken tweeted this out today. Today, I announced a new visa restrictions policy targeting individuals and their family members involved in or meaningfully contributing to actions that undermine peace, security, and stability in the West Bank. Violence against civilians will have consequences. So what they're going to do is they're basically going to tell a bunch of settlers in the West Bank who are taking advantage of what has gone on since October 7th, and they are increasingly violent. There's always a lot of violence between the violent settlers who are really, really nuts. And I mean, you don't know this level of nuts in the United States. When I was over there in the West Bank, I came across some of these settlers. And I've never, people talk about extremists living in America. No, you don't know extremists until you come across some Israeli settlers because they are crazy. They are like what you imagine in history books and movies or video games even. And they're real life. And so what they do is they're armed and they go and they steal Palestinian lands. They burn their olive trees. They commit acts of violence. And since October 7th, 9 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed by these settlers. The problem is that Israel does nothing about this. When a Palestinian throws a rock, the Israelis go hard after that Palestinian, round them up, sometimes shoot them and kill them, don't allow any ambulances to come near them or anybody to come near them, let them bleed out and die, throw them in jail, let them rot, no court. It's all military law, so they're not subject to actual laws. They're not given actual rights. It's all just military occupation law. So when a Palestinian commits an act of violence, the IDF comes down really hard on the Palestinians. Meanwhile, when it comes to the settlers in the West Bank, and I watched this with my own eyes, the IDF actually escorts them. The IDF will actually protect the aggressive settlers. And when the settlers commit acts of violence against the Palestinians, it's often the IDF just standing there watching and nothing happens. And this is one of the issues that has caused so much anger amongst the Palestinian population, is that they're lacking justice entirely in this. It's not just about land, but it's also just about justice, is that the Israelis will allow Palestinians to be killed, will allow Palestinians to be harmed, will allow their land to be taken by these aggressive settlers, and they stand there and do nothing about it. It's kind of an excuse. I mean, look, Israel can't legally go and take the land. The government can't go and take the land. The government can't go and kill these Palestinians. They do, but when it comes to these kind of smaller things that they're doing, the government does this and says, well, we're not. And then they use these settlers as their proxies, and they basically have these violent settlers go and do their dirty work for them, for the things that they're not legally allowed to do. And then they just turn a blind eye. They don't actually prosecute these people. So the Biden administration knows this. They know that this has been escalating, and they've said, hey, wait a minute, guys, we can't allow this to continue happening. You have to do something about it. So the Biden administration says that they've been talking to the Israeli government about it, that they've been pressuring them to actually do something about West Bank settler violence, but they don't. But Israel's not doing anything about it. And so the U.S., their response, rather than sanction Israel, which is what they should do, they should say to the Israeli government, hey, not okay. You cannot have a double standard legal system going on over there where Palestinians have no rights after they get killed. Nobody does anything about it. And we're going to sanction you as a country. No, they're instead saying, well, we're going to sanction the settlers who are never going to get on a plane and come to America, who have no desire to ever travel to the United States. And they're going to say, well, we're just going to restrict their visa. So they're not ever able to travel to a country they weren't planning on traveling to anyway. That's the response. it's just a piss poor response. It's meaningless. It's just symbolic. That's all it is. But the symbolism is there. At least it's better than turning a blind eye completely. This is the first time that settlers in the West Bank have been targeted by the U.S. government since the Clinton administration. So that, I guess, counts for something. It just needs to be more. So they're kind of inching in that direction, it seems like, the Biden administration, but they absolutely need to do more. Because the violence against the Palestinians in the West Bank, which is not in Gaza, it's on the other side of the country, the violence has just become commonplace, and it's really, truly increased. And what's made it worse, and one of the reasons why if you don't believe me, that the Israeli government turns a blind eye, they actually enshrined it into law that settlers were a national treasure, that this is part of the fabric of Israel. In 2018, they passed a law. It's called a nation-state law. It's part of their basic law, so it's like in their constitution, that called Jewish settlement efforts a national value, and that the state would encourage and promote this national value. This is enshrined in their laws. The law says, quote, "The state shall act to preserve the cultural, historical, and religious heritage of the Jewish people among Jews in the diaspora. The state views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation." Slap in the face to the Palestinians when they passed this law. Part of this law also was enshrining into the Constitution that Israel's for Jews and not for anybody else, and that only Jews in Israel have the right to national self-determination, that doesn't belong to any other group. And that was a big slap in the face. That was just recently passed in 2018, including that, settlers, that's a national value. So this has got to be cracked down on. We'll give them, I guess, a little bit of some props that they at least did call it out, that they're at least going to do something about it, even though it's really minor. At least they are calling attention to it, and they are saying to Israel, we're not happy and you need to do something. But I still assert the U.S. government could do a lot more. Well, I like knowing exactly where my meat comes from. And with Moink, that place is from small family farms all across the country. And you can help save the family farm and get access to the highest quality meat on earth when you join the Moink movement today. Moink delivers grass-fed and grass-finished beef, lamb, pastured pork and chicken, and sustainable wild-caught Alaskan salmon straight to your door. Moink farmers farm like our grandparents did, and as a result, Moink meat tastes like it should because the family farm does it better. The Moink difference is one that you can really taste, and you can feel good knowing that you're helping family farms stay financially independent too. You choose the meat delivered in every box, like ribeyes to chicken breasts to pork chops to salmon fillets and much more. Plus, you can cancel anytime. I love Moink meat. I eat this practically every day right now. I had some top sirloin earlier today for lunch, and it really is truly better meat. You actually can taste a difference. I love my Moink meat, and I know you will too. So keep American farming going by signing up at moinkbox.com/Kim right now. And listeners of this show will get free ground beef for a year. That's 1 year of the best ground beef you'll ever taste, but for a limited time. So that is spelled Moink, MOINK, box.com/Kim. That's moinkbox.com/Kim.